Between the 1500s and the 1900s, Britain experienced successive waves of migration, both in and out of the country. But why did these mass movements of people take place? What was the experience of the migrants, and how did their comings and goings affect this country and its people? I'm in the grounds of a former stately home in Berkshire. Building a grand house like this in the British countryside to go with your house in London was once the standard practice for anyone intent on climbing up the British class system. To some extent, it still is. By the 1700s, Britain's rural economy was slowly giving way to an industrial one. Industrial manufacture and trade, these were the new ways to get rich. This house, Swallowfield near Reading, is now luxury flats, but in the early 1800s it was bought by a British migrant, a man who'd made his money in India.
This is a picture of the middle-class family with aspirations to be more than middle class. The Russells are originally a merchant's family in Dover in Kent, and Sir Henry Russell, the first baronet, is through patronage able to go to university and go to Lincoln's Inn and become a barrister. So this is the second Sir Henry, and as a little child, as a 4-year-old, dressed in his skirts with his mother, Lady Russell.
So what allows the Russell family to make this transition from being a middle-class family to being a family with great pretensions of aristocratic wealth?
Well, in one word, I would say India.
European powers started trading with India from the early 1500s, with Portugal taking the initial lead. At first, all British trade was dominated by the London-based East India Company, which was granted the monopoly on trade with India in 1600. Over the following 200 years, the company became increasingly prominent in the European trading routes with India.
In order to become an employee of the East India Company, you have to be recommended by a director, a major shareholder. So it's who you know that gets you into the East India Company. You might not have met your cousin at all recently, but you will pull on his connections with the East India Company to get your way in. So these families work as big networks. They use anyone they know.
And we see this over and over again, historically and in our society today.
We see it in politics, we see it in Parliament, we see it in the educational sector. This is a pervasive pattern in British history. And the East India Company illustrates it in the 1700s and the 1800s.
They then bring the money back to Britain.
Yeah, the purpose of Indian settlement for the East India Company employees is never to stay there permanently. It's always to come back home and to bring their money back home with them.
So what do the Russells do when they finally start coming back to Britain?
The Indian wealth always has a bit of a tinge, a bit of a shady tinge. In the 18th century, families such as the Russells are referred to as nabobs, and nabobs are very much looked down upon. These are people who are too rich by half. The intention, absolutely, is to become part of the governing class of Britain, part of the landed governing class.
So they want to make it look as if they were the landed aristocracy, and not that they're people who made a lot of money very quickly in India.
Precisely. And they do that very strategically. They use the building, they use the architecture, they use their political position in the locality and nationally. So Henry Russell becomes a justice of the peace, a local power broker in the county. He's one of the people who can imprison you. He's one of the people who helps govern the poor law in the area. This is Charles. He becomes not only a Tory MP for Reading, he also invests substantial amounts of his and his brother's Indian money in the building of the Great Western Railway. So he becomes an industrial broker as well as a political power broker in Parliament. You've got to have a lot of disposable income. You end up bribing quite a lot of people to get into Parliament in this time period. This is before the first Reform Act. You also need money to treat people, to encourage them to vote for you, and it's Indian wealth that allows Charles then to become an MP for Reading. Charles, of course, being in Parliament, he's going to vote a particular way to protect his political interests. And of course, it's Parliament that approves as well railway lines and railway companies. Well, he's a part of that system. He rises to be chairman of the Great Western Railway. There are a lot of Berkshire men who are old East India Company employees, and they come back, gain landed wealth, gain political wealth, and have enormous social wealth with this. These are places of sociability, but sociability is tied to political power in this time period. Wellington, of course, who is a local, was also somebody who the Russells knew in India. The family make their initial fortune militarily and politically in India. Many political families, not only at this time period, but indeed today, owe much of their wealth and power to the East India Company in its origins. One of those, for example, is our current Prime Minister, David Cameron.
The Russells are a perfect example of how, during the industrial and colonial era, the families who came together to form the power elite of the East India Company, the nabobs, with their networks of influence reaching out across time and over the generations, were able to use their wealth to buy power, and not just political power, the power to influence and affect their whole society.